are Finn Golding and Hayden Shaughnessy of Flow Academy. They join us to share their story of the evolution of the transformation sprint. Hayden and Fin developed the Flow approach to ways of working across the business. Flow takes agile concepts out of IT and makes them true business agility tools. A lot said about Flow right now. Some of it reintroduces the idea of frameworks and systems, but Fin and Hayden talk about the social interaction, how we can calm the chaos of human interaction and provide tools that make us all more collaborative, creative, and productive. The session will be in the form of a presentation and interactive Q&A. Fin and Hayden are comfortable taking questions during their presentation, so please share your questions in the chat and our facilitators will surface these during the event. The transformation sprint evolved from their work on enterprise flow, where they observed a number of fault lines in how business transformations are designed and then executed. In response to this, they began to work on the concept of a generative operating mode. I'll now hand you over to Hayden and Fin to share a little more with you.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Michael. So, hi everybody, good afternoon or good evening or wherever you are in the world. We are in Ireland, so both Hayden and I are in the sunny Ireland. I'm in Dublin and he's in Kinsale in Cork. We're going to talk to you about this transformation sprint, but how it actually evolved and how we evolved it through our work, which is, as Michael said, with Flow. And first of all, we'll start by introducing ourselves. So maybe Hayden, I'm going to get you to start.
Yes, so good morning, evening, afternoon. So Finn and I come from different parts of the business culture, business environment, whereas Finn, who'll talk about himself in a second, is from the IT side. I'm much more from the business side. And I've had the good fortune to also do a lot of writing around the things that I've observed inside businesses. I've done a lot of work as an analyst and that type of role. And right now, if you look at the Thinkers 360 league table, I'm #1 in digital transformation. It's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about. And I've written in the Harvard Business Review for Wall Street Journal and worked for companies like Royal Bank of Scotland, Swift, Nokia, CLS, European Commission. So a bit of background there on the types of companies. But I think my primary interest in this area has been, what is it that companies know they should be doing but don't do? And it's one of the things we'll touch on, that very often companies know they're doing the wrong thing and know what the right thing is, but it never quite happens. And that's something that maybe we can talk about as we go through.
Great. And Hayden said, I'm the kind of IT guy, so basically a CIO and CTO. So I started my career mostly in financial services, big banks, Royal Bank of Scotland, HSBC, etc. Then payment processing with Visa. I moved to the US there. I was in San Francisco for a few years. And then switched over to the .com world. So CTO at lastminute.com, Travelocity.com, PaddyPower.com, and also worked with an offshore development team in Argentina for 3 years. So knowing what it's like to be on that side of the fence was critical to my learning as a technologist. And then taking all that knowledge around what was happening in startups and then moving back into the sort of financial space again, trying to use some of those skills to help organizations transform. But I've seen both sides of the coin, and a lot of what we do and have done has been based around our experiences in the actual real world, shall we say. At Flow Academy, what we actually do is fix or start transformations. That's the transformation sprint. We do a lot of work around digital strategy, which is enterprise flow. We'll talk a bit about operating models in this presentation, but we have something called the Flow operating model. And we also teach organizations how to work more effectively, and that's our lighthouse thinking. But on top of that, we do training and research, but we also write books and do a lot of content creation. So when we work with clients, we then take some of that and try and use it to produce more and more material to help other organizations. Hayden and I met in 2013. Believe it or not, this was my office at Paddy Power. When I joined Paddy Power, I had a desk like a lot of other people, but as the CTO, I had a big office. And sitting on my own, I thought, this is not quite right. This doesn't feel good from a working experience, because I'd been at there's some startups where we didn't even have a desk. You'd fight to find your desk, and I had this massive office. I turned it into an agora, and the world record for that office was 50 people. So we had 50 people in my office at some point, and it became a talking point in the organization, because at first facilities hated it. By the end of the day, it was their idea. But anyway, Hayden came to meet me in Dublin with some of his clients in the banking industry. Maybe you want to pick it up from there, Hayden, why you came to watch what we were up to.
Yeah, well, in the banking sector at the time, I was doing a lot of work for banks on their disruption threat around about 2016, 17. And they were in this situation that I mentioned earlier. You could almost guarantee if you interviewed those people individually, they would have a good idea of what the bank needed to do. But collectively, they never got it done. They never actually came to the right conclusions, and they never were going to do the right thing. So I took them on a tour of companies that were doing great stuff. And at that time, Paddy Power would be one of those in Europe where you'd say, yeah, they've really got this. They were already doing DevOps. They're already doing 50 or more deliveries a day. And had managed to re-platform whilst they kept the business running, all the kind of things that banks needed to do. So we tipped up one day with a half dozen of them to listen to how it should really be done.
And one of the things that we were doing from an agility point of view was incorporating more of the leadership and some of the business functions in what we were doing. So there was a greater connection between what was being delivered and the people who were deciding what we should be doing. And a lot of that work we were doing was kind of pioneering back then. And Hayden kind of convinced me that we should write a book, which we did. We called Flow, and Flow itself, it's quite a popular book. And that then made us think, well, we're onto something here. We quickly followed it up with a second book, which is a bit more for the fanboys, has less pictures and a lot more information about the steps required to use this way of working. And we deliberately used flow. We were trying to, use an expression that wasn't necessarily agile, because I think in some businesses, even the word agile is not that well received. So what is flow? It used to be a lot of visualization and a lot of interaction between individuals, as they say, all parts of an organization. Now it's a little bit more online, but same sort of thing, using various different tools. Maybe I'll let you take this one, Hayden.
Yeah, I think you see with those pictures, what we're illustrating those pictures is that flow is a set of venues that people can gather around and talk about important issues. They're very focused because the issue you're going to talk about is there in front of you. It's very transparent, stuff's not hidden in Jira or some other database. It's there to really try to trigger the collective intelligence of groups through social interaction. And we say good decisions in business are made through good social interaction. And very often that's the missing ingredient in a lot of companies. People are not talking freely, not talking often enough. They're in meetings where they're being told to align. So we were developing these visualizations to really create a minimalist framework for organizations to get to new ways to work. And those new ways to work were very much about social interaction. It did combine our interests in that Fin, I think, had already cracked the code on Agile in software, but companies weren't finding the right way to move that set of ideas about Agile into the business. So, of course, we all care about business Agile in this meeting, but it was very difficult because a lot of the things that go on in the Agile, in the IT shop, so they are very kind of jargonized to some extent. They're rituals which IT people have bought into, but business people maybe won't buy into. So there was another problem, which is that whilst the business wants to be business agile, it still struggles to perceive customers and markets properly. It tends to think about markets in terms of that group of people that it targets with its products, not that group or those many groups of people that have fluctuating and changing needs that they need to adapt their products and services to help fulfill. So those are the things that we were trying to crack. Let's get that idea of agility into the business, and let's try and do that through these visualization and social interaction techniques, and particularly let's try and do that through changing the way companies think about their markets and their customer relationships.
In that picture is a managing director and her leadership team with post-it notes. And whenever that happens, I get very happy. Anyway, so the key elements of flow, as Hayden said, we're trying to extend Agile upstream into the business and have a greater focus on customer innovation and it's delivery of value rather than delivery of pace at pace. And pace is something I'm used to, but even at pace, we could still deliver things which weren't very valuable. We used to deliver crap at speed in some companies I've worked in. And so upstream, having a better understanding of what's going to work is key. And that's where traditional methods in the business tend to be a little bit antiquated. So getting leaders involved in this, making sure they rationalize the work that's currently in play and constantly looking at the work that's in a portfolio, because it's being delivered by a lot of people and a lot of expense. Also within this, using my own background, was to ensure that the business teams understand that IT needs time for themselves for refactoring, regenerating, replacing and upgrading. And sometimes that doesn't happen. That slows down the delivery of value. And we kind of have some of the visualizations we saw as a new form of governance, because I've worked in banks and places like that, insurance companies, where governance is quite high. And moving them to a visual model actually is quite difficult at first, but once they get it, then it becomes quite empowering. In fact, a chief risk officer at Aviva used to take photographs of the walls as a record for where we were in the journey of managing risk and delivering change. Anyway, so it's new ways to work, particularly visualization, social interaction and collaboration, and using the power of the team to give you that collective intelligence. So it actually came from the need to help, create these new ways of working to help companies who were transforming or needed to transform. That's kind of where we saw it working best as well. Maybe you can take the evolution of methods, Hayden.
Sure. So we want to relate the evolution of flow to the development of business agility. They're very closely related, in fact. So if you look at what companies do, I think most organizations, most executive teams would have some sense that business agility is an imperative. They may be preoccupied with other things, like maybe preoccupied with their version of what customer needs are, or what their customer promise is, what their brand promise is. So they have these preoccupations which are often get in the way of them thinking about business agility. I read an interesting quote yesterday from an organization that deals with health. And it said that, those people have heart attacks. They're advised to change their diet, they're advised to exercise. Actually, only 3 to 5% of people do that, even though the price of not doing it is dying, actually. So there's a curious element of human behavior that we often know what we need to do, but we don't get to do it. And it tends to be that way with business agility. And we've talked to a lot of organizations who say, we could never have started with flow until we implemented SAFE, until we'd satisfied executives that we were doing the right thing, in the sense of imposing new rules. Here's business agility. Well, here's a set of rules for it. And that's what happens in organizations. They know they should be doing flow. They go and buy SAFE, or they go and buy something else. Once all that dust is settled, you stand a chance of starting to try and convince people. But faced with that, we knew that flow had to evolve. Flow does evolve anyway. It's constantly evolving. That's its nature. If you're starting lots and lots of conversations, you get lots of new ideas and you get lots of momentum behind them. But because of that, because it's a very open-ended, transparent set of techniques, it poses the risk of too much change. Organizations don't like it at the beginning. They want to impose their rules first. So we felt we needed to create tools that promote a much simpler, low-risk way to adapt it to business agility. That's what companies need. They don't really need it, but that's what they believe they need. If they believe they need it, we needed to develop flow or evolve flow so we can meet that kind of requirement.
We also had to come up with a way that organizations could adopt flow as well. That was a much, as Hayden said, much lower risk approach. In fact, I'm going to let you take the next couple of slides.
So we saw a couple of other challenges as well. And one of the important ones is that companies have become preoccupied with their business model. And it's something that's happened over the last 20 years. It's not new. It's not from last year or the year before. But if you go back over the 20 years where we've had a kind of an explosion of startups in the business world, it's something that the major businesses, larger businesses have tried to emulate, and they've got on this bandwagon of, we need to change our business model. And to a certain extent, that's true. As soon as you've got the web, and as soon as you've got mobile telephony, global connectivity, they did need to change their business model, also to reflect things like lower transaction costs. So the problem with that is that, well, go back to prior to, say, 2000, most organizations were actually more focused on their operating models. What can I do to my processes? And it was things like the introduction of ERP, unfortunately, that was one of those. What can I do to my processes to make me more efficient, to reduce my costs, to make me quicker to market, those types of things. So we found, this again to be a source of friction when we deal with companies, that they are thinking business model. And it's true to say that it's very important. The business model reflects the sources of revenue. It reflects the value proposition of the company. It's things like, where you're like an Amazon, trying to emphasize that you'll sell every product, great business model. There's almost nothing you can't buy on Amazon, or that you're shifting to recurring revenues, you're going to subscriptions, or you are becoming more customer centric. Not always true, not often true. Or you're shifting from physical goods to digital services, and in that case, what you're looking at is very often trying to take advantage of a zero marginal cost benefit of being digital. So there's all these reasons why you should think about your business model. However, next slide, operating model is as critical, if not more critical, because organizations haven't really focused on it that much in the last 20 years, or haven't focused on it systematically enough and learned operating model design skills. The operating model reflects how you go about getting those revenues. If the business model is how you get the revenue, the operating model is what's the infrastructure, what are the services, what are the technologies that you need in order to do that. So you might find some of these kind of operating model switches have been quite common, things like if you're a B2B to C organization, like an insurance company might have brokers and never really talk to end customers. You need to get rid of that intermediary. The history of the web is the history of disintermediation to some extent. So reorganizing your operating model in that sense, or you can grow a microtransaction capability. Who would have thought that you can sell goods online for under $1, 99 cents, all the way back in 2001 with iTunes? But having that ability, I must say, I transferred money from our bank account to a client recently. We were charged 15 euros for the transaction. Whereas if you're Apple, you can sell at 40, or Google, you can sell at 40 cents, 50 cents, 60 cents. So this new capability to transact at very low prices is an operating model change. Or maybe you need to re-platform, as Fin did at Paddy Power, or you need to grow community. That's an operating model change. Very, very difficult for companies to invest in community. There's no clear ROI for them. You're saying, give me 2 million to invest in these people. Well, what's the ROI and when do I start to see it? Difficult question to answer. So somewhat a counterintuitive operating model change, or you become more software centric or more data centric. These are all operating model changes that are going on. And our argument is that companies have not been mindful enough or conscious enough about those things. And they therefore get wrapped up into a big transformation program that in itself, because it's a big transformation program, poses a risk to any of those things happening in a timely way.
And so maybe you're thinking like me, or I used to, what is an operating model? And this is one of the ones that we've used. There are traditional ones that we could have showed you, but we're not really here to talk about all of this today. We want to talk about the evolution of what we do. And the evolution was really that, if you think about it, value delivery is the IT part, IT agile in this particular diagram. And value management might be seen as program PMO type style of management of delivering that value to the team to deliver. So we thought of that as more the adaptive kind of PMO world. And value discovery, you don't find too many organizations doing that effectively, but it would be a kind of a sophisticated product teams and product management functions. But as Hayden said, I was more involved in looking at how core platforms were affecting the operating model. So to deliver faster, needed better core platforms. And some organizations have got platforms that have been around a really long time. They're not very easy to amend or change. And in fact, with thinking about it in this way, you can see that it becomes an inhibitor to delivering value if they're very legacy. Now, there are some good old platforms, which we call heritage, but again, they themselves can be, if they're not taken care of, can actually slow you down. And now we add into the mix in terms of the operating model is your focus on risk and security, which is higher than ever before. The capabilities of your team, and this is one of the things that is a concern when we look at large organizations, that how much of that core capability is outsourced, which at some point in their journey, when they want to bring it back in-house, they can't do. They haven't got the skills there. And they don't have the techniques or learning mechanisms, not just for individuals, but actually learning about what's happening in the market to their products and services. So delivering all this through, some sort of mechanism towards your customers and partners, we see as a modern kind of operating model. I don't think you want to add anything else to that, Hayden.
Yeah, I think just to illustrate, I'm going to take a question before I go on and talk a little bit about value discovery very briefly. So Ellen's asking, how do you relate the topic of flow to lean? We don't feel a need to do that. We believe that there are techniques out there, like there is design thinking, there are things like SAFe, there are other techniques like lean. What we think of as flow is more about the social interaction and how you develop that social interaction into something creative, collaborative, and productive. So the things that we're talking about are really, if you look at something like value management, you could say, well, the lean portfolio management is a form of value management. We tend to think of value management as being more like a venue where people come together to look at what that portfolio is doing, whether it's meeting corporate objectives or whether it's properly organized or if it's missing things. And our argument is you can rarely do that as one individual or one specialized team. You need the collective intelligence of the people around you to say, actually, I think you're missing a couple of key areas of that portfolio, or actually those three elements of the portfolio have nothing to do with our objectives. Should our objectives change, or should those projects be dropped? So you can still do lean portfolio management, but what you also need is this ability to draw on the widest possible intelligence in your organization to get the portfolio right. So anyway, I hope that clears it up, Alan. If not, just drop another question in and we'll come back to it.
I was going to quickly say that I'm a big fan of lean and focus on waste and some other techniques in terms of Kanban, etc. But in some organizations we talk to where they have a Six Sigma embedded, it's hated by individuals. It's used for the wrong mechanisms. And so when we look at flow, those concepts are kind of partly there in terms of value streams, etc. But the way it's done is a much simpler way, and it's much more accessible to a wider group of people without having to be overly trained. Sorry. Carry on.
I think as well, lean's adaptive too, isn't it? Lean is always migrating and taking in other areas like lean UX. But if you go back only not even 10 years, like 8 years, there were organizations that were being cleaned out in the name of lean. And I remember going into one organization in Brussels and starting to talk about my ideas around lean. And they said, do not mention the word lean in this house, because we've seen a lot of our colleagues given their P45 and being told to go. So lean is a double-edged sword in a way. And we feel there's a lot to be said for being very pro social interaction and very pro the kind of people factor, not using these frameworks to retire people out of the business. But just in terms of value discovery, there's something in there actually which may illustrate it as well. What we think of, what a lot of people think of in terms of value discovery are things like Lean Startup, say, Eric Ries's book. Lean Startup and the MVP is flooding IT organizations with far too much work. It's probably one of the main things that you can hold to account for IT departments being overworked. But it doesn't actually give you a way to discover anything in your market. What it does is say, here's my product, here's my idea. Now I'm going to give you some spiral iterations so you can understand the cost of it and the potential returns on it. So in effect, it's like an accounting mechanism. Whereas what we think of as value discovery is, what are your customer segments? How deeply can you segment your customer markets, your markets into customer segments? And what value can you give to those different segments? How can you scale value across them? Look at something like Netflix. It has 1,300 customer segments that it works with. Amazon has thousands of segments that it works with. So in value discovery terms, it's about going outside the organization. It's not a technique for improving or proving the value of something you've got. It's an inquiry and a discovery process.
So
always,
yeah. So what we discover is that transformations really, very rarely focus on the operating model, as we've just been talking about, and they do get focused on adding more stuff to the business, and generally that means more stuff to IT, and generally it means on top of old platforms, which kind of brings us to where we see there are, like, in terms of operating models, there are 4 kind of key issues underlying transformational failure. And so one of them is that core platform challenge. I very rarely would an organization take a core platform that's running their business, their main platforms, and replace it or change it or modernize it. And it's because it's done in very large chunks, like maybe every 20 years a change is required, and that it becomes too difficult, and platform transformations fail all the time because of that. Context and models, we mentioned SAFe and say Spotify as models that are probably applicable to other organizations, but not always applicable to yours. So we talk a lot about context and making sure you understand your context. And unfortunately, we find that some consultancies will take an off-the-shelf model and try and plug it into an organization where there is the incorrect fit, and that can also cause transformational issues. Oops, we've got to double up here. The kind of like IT-centric, I think we could have mentioned that in terms of IT is, I mean, I'm an IT background, but it's having that agile as being something that's always in IT. It's less seen as something that can be spread out into the business, and some of those frameworks are pretty inflexible. And then the big program approach to transformation is another issue. Partly it lacks leadership involvement, but it's the way that it's set up. It requires the large PMO, maybe a big 4 consultancy with lots of resources, and that it's not unusual to see programs that are 12 months, 15 months, 2 years before they even start to deliver any value or any impact. And in fact, that's how we got involved in, we're talking to organizations about using flow, and they're saying, hang on, I'm in the middle of a transformation and it's really a disaster. Can you help us? And when we sat back and looked at the approach that organizations were taking, we thought, actually, why isn't there really much more of an agile approach to transformation? Why should it be this size of program where you've got to go and get 50 people or 100 people? It didn't make sense to us. So we thought there's got to be a different approach. So we focus on an agile approach, our agile approach. Maybe you want to cover this one, Hayden.
Yeah, well, I think we've said some of these things, so just to reiterate them, we're also, I suppose we should remind ourselves that we're trying to talk about how we've evolved the social interaction and visualizations that we've talked about. But therefore, as you go and start thinking about what would an agile approach to transformation look like, rather than the big transformation project, collective intelligence, visualization, collaboration are kind of typical for us. That's what we want to bring to transformation planning or transformation fixing. But critically also the early delivery of value. And it's extraordinary, actually. You can have conversations with people where you say, we'll deliver value for you in a month. And it's almost like a threat, because what they're used to is a schedule, a Gantt chart, something that looks out 6, 9, 12 months, has milestones and deliverables. And we just say, no, we can design this project so we start delivering value in 4 weeks' time. In fact, with transformation sprints, we do them in 4 weeks. So early delivery of value, you've got to get that into the business, not just have it as something that we associate with IT. Using holistic teams as well, trying to bring people from IT and business together, trying to bridge that IT divide. Making sure that there are incremental steps to value and delivery, not just early delivery, but you're planning your projects in such a way that they're not pegged to artificial deliverables or milestones, but you can sequentially deliver more and more value. There's something that I hadn't quite realized until I started talking to Finn about it, but most projects are probably delivering the bulk of their value within the first 20% of their features. And what comes next is just a grind, and very often it's stuff that's not used. So if you can actually start to understand what delivers value and define what delivers value, deliver it early and deliver it sequentially, you may actually not do a big chunk of the project that previously you would have been obliged to do. We try and time box that as well, so it's not just it's early delivery, it's frequent delivery, but it's time box. Can we do this in a month? Can we do it in 2 weeks? How much can we draw it back? And that kind of thing is what gives you a very low risk but very adaptive approach, and allows you to pivot, because you can actually a bit more than just being able to pivot and being adaptive. If you do things in this way, if you're trying to deliver value quickly, you're much better able to learn about what it is you're actually trying to do. And a lot of projects can start with a strong definition of outcomes, but actually once you get into it, those outcomes start to look not the right outcomes, or even not appropriate outcomes. So being able to learn about what the outcome should be, being able to learn about your organization's ability or inability to deliver, those are really, really important parts of the agile approach to transformation. They are the learning mechanisms that we're trying to embed in what we do in the transformation sprint. So again, keeping in the tradition of agile, some of those learning mechanisms can be realized through test and learn, show and tell, try and get executives involved quite frequently in that. And then leading all that, leading on from all that, being able to scale through building enough experience and knowledge in your core team that those people can go out and populate other teams and spread the word. That's our version of what an agile transformation should start like.
Yeah, and we have had some skepticism around the cell division scaling, but it works, and it's easier than training 100 people in how to use a particular methodology and then waiting for some value to be given to them to actually deliver. And so we found that this method is actually, you can make more course corrections in one team before making a mistake in doing something too large with some of the traditional rollouts. So
before we move on, Finn, how often, this is from Nadazja, sorry, can't quite pronounce that. How often learning is seen by organizations as value, and what kind of outcomes are mostly expected as a result of transformation sprints? So I think in terms of the value of transformation sprints outcomes, it's very diverse, really. So if you're talking about in an incremental sense, what kind of things can you do quickly? If you're doing something that's very customer related, and maybe the instinct of a large company is to do big kind of metrics around what its customers want, or to move to a single view of the customer, a very large data-centric project like that, we'd be much more inclined to say you can go out and do a very quick insight project in 2 or 3 weeks and learn something new about your customers without having to do a big single view of the customer project. You will always do the big single view of the customer project, but you need to couple it to something that gives you insight next week or next month. In terms of how often learning is seen by organizations as value, Finn, perhaps you'd want to respond based on your experience.
I think there's two aspects to it. I think one is that most organizations I've worked in have seen it as a cost rather than as a value. And my objective was always to overspend the training budget and also find effective ways to train people, which wouldn't necessarily cost money. It was actually using buddy systems and people training each other, and finding time within the work week to allow people to collectively share. So try and keep about 4 days of the week towards your main job, and then 1 day of the week around training each other. So I saw it as a value, because the more skills that people get, the more value they can deliver. And some organizations, as I say, unfortunately, don't just see it as a big cost. And when there's a problem like, say, for instance, COVID, the first thing that gets cut is training budgets. And I always felt that was like taking the gas out of the car and forcing you to break down. But anyway, my opinion. So what we did was, in this approach, was taking that agile concept and our belief in learning, etc., and create the transformation sprint as a way that as we could target change, time box it within large transformations themselves. And in the transformation sprint itself, it's got 6 parts to it. I'll let you start those, Hayden. We'll try and do this together.
Sure. Well, one of the things that we try to do is to gather perspectives from all levels of an organization. And there's a huge amount of value in that, because generally speaking, it's the upper echelon that's in charge of the transformation. They're the ones hiring the consultants, and they're the ones who feel they've got the single version of the truth. Without fail, every organization we go into where we talk to people at different levels, we find out lots of different truths. And they are all really, really valuable, because they highlight a lot of the dysfunctionality. And the reason that's important is very often what we find is that transformations are designed with almost like the dream goal, that they'll have, we're going to make this much more money, we're going to grow by this amount, we're going to lose this many staff, we're going to be ultra modern, whatever it is. The tendency in the transformation design is almost the dream outcome, the best possible outcome. When you talk to people at different levels of the organization, you find all this dysfunctionality that's been glossed over, but nonetheless needs to be addressed in the transformation. So for us, that's a very, very good start point for designing a low-risk transformation sprint.
Exactly, and pulling that data together and actually trying to analyze it, taking in also external information, market information, as Hayden said, various levels of information, and synthesizing that in some way to come up with an issues document, which is, look, these are the top 10 things we need to focus on. And some of those things can be the headwinds which are stopping you from moving forward. So you need to put in place maybe some new ways of working, or it can be, look, we know exactly what we need to do. We want to break into this market and we want to develop something to actually deliver. And to be able to do that, you kind of need to know where you currently are and where you need to get to. So why don't you talk about the state descriptions?
Yeah, just reflecting on the analyses, it's worth saying that in the book, we've listed the kinds of things that go wrong because we find them to be very common. We don't find them to be so common that they're the same in every organization. But if you have a list of 20, you're going to find 15 of those in every organization you go into. So that's just to say, that's why you can do the analysis really quickly. That's why you can contain all this in a 4-week period. You actually don't need to do a huge amount of discovery. You can rely on the perspectives, the interviews and the perspectives, and a kind of template of analysis to do that. So what we try to do once we've done those things, and we have a lot of documentation. I see somebody's asking what is the method to collect all this information. It is partly the interviews. Yes, it's interviews, it's not a survey. It's also the documentation. So what's the strategy documentation, the technical architecture documentation, all those things go into the mix. And what they allow us to do is to describe the current condition of the company. We tend to do that, again, in a templated way. We have a number of concentric circles which describe things like what the core platform problems are, what the ecosystem of the organization looks like, internal and external, what the capabilities look like. And by standardizing that analysis, we can also standardize the to-be state. So we have over here, this is your as is. It's a description of your current operating model. Over here is a description of the operating model you appear to be moving towards. And that's also a very important concept in transformation sprints. When you do those interviews, you can start to see emergent future operating model potential. Companies will already have started to do new things. They'll already have a data project of some kind that's under realized, or they'll have a platform project that's going wrong. But nonetheless, it's there and it's a clue as to how it's actually evolving its operating model. Do you want to cover the last two there, Finn?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, once you have that information, it's played back to the leadership and get their help in prioritizing what you should focus on. And that's quite illuminating to see the leadership teams who are blindsided by what's really happening in the organization. And out of that, just to focus in on one initiative to, actually start the transformation. That could be one thing itself, and we call it a lighthouse or a lighthouse project. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But using the sprint mechanism, what you can do is you can actually focus on just one process that needs to change. say, for instance, some dysfunctionality somewhere and come up with a method for testing that out in a lighthouse. It could be a project, a program, or a product development. It could actually be for ways of working. Quite often when we do these 6 stages, we find that the portfolio of work is an issue. We don't have enough people, we don't have enough time, we're doing too much. And when we analyze that portfolio, we find that really only 20% of that portfolio is actually associated with the strategic goals of the company. But you can also use this to start that entire operating model change but in small steps and what we call the right steps. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But fundamentally, what we try to do is to say, this Lighthouse project, that's where you arrive at. And it has these 5 key priorities. Why don't you take them, Hayden?
Yeah, we said earlier that when you look inside a transformation, you see a lot of dysfunctionality that's not included necessarily in the transformation design. So what we try and do is to pull people back to that fact, say, it's okay to have these perfect outcomes or this dream outcome, but you have to deal with some areas of this dysfunctionality. The way we try and do that is through new ways to work. So it's like saying, instead of the big design, the big transformation program, let's try and address 1 or 2 elements of dysfunctionality that are killing you in some way or other. But let's address it in an agile way. Let's use new ways of working to address the operating model dysfunctionality. Let's do it in a way that delivers value early and regularly. And let's make sure we're all learning from that. So basically what we're trying to learn is this the right project? Is it addressing the structural issue that we suffer from in the right way? Is it giving us any clues as to where we should go next? Is it telling us anything about our capability or lack of capability, what we need to learn, who we need to hire? So it's in that sense acting as a learning environment. It's teaching you about transformation, really. And it is, as we said earlier, something that you want to make sure that you scale up. So you should already be thinking, as you design that lighthouse, what's the next lighthouse going to be, and what's the next lighthouse? Because you want to redeploy those teams.
And so we probably answered this already, but why the lighthouse? In fact, we'll be publishing tomorrow some information about Lighthouse thinking and Lighthouse Project, which if you follow us on LinkedIn, you'll find that, and you're welcome to have a copy of our study. But this is about providing a smaller incremental approach to transformational change, but with big results. And in fact, we ensure that leaders are involved in this and are actually learning at the same time. In this project, you are reskilling or giving people new skills and getting them more focused around value and designing and delivering value. And we call it the essence of business agility because when you talk to leaders about delivering value, that's the language they understand. It's not about we're going to deliver microservices or an enterprise service bus, or we're going to do a cloud server. I mean, these are things that they could glaze over. But when we talk about value and what it means to the customers, then you've got them involved. We're nearly finished, and we'll just cover some of the sort of major benefits. Why don't you start that, Hayden? Yes.
So I had a clever thought there, and it's just, as always, completely escaped. But what we're talking about is trying to say, as we said at the start, the goal is business agility, but companies are buying into something else. They're buying into business rigidity through frameworks. And what we need to do is not sort of bang on about why that's wrong, or try and preach to companies about business agility. We need to find ways, we need to find these mechanisms that mean executives feel comfortable having invested in SAFe or having poured money into a Spotify model, at the same time feel comfortable with doing it the right way, because it's very difficult to persuade them not to do it the wrong way. And as I said earlier, very often the fact that they have done it the wrong way is what opens the opportunity to try another way. So the benefits of doing it through a lighthouse, I think the lighthouse is really important. In the magazine we're issuing tomorrow, we're talking about the way real lighthouses used to be built. There's one down the coast here in Ireland where you've got to build a lighthouse in force 10 gales. The Atlantic is so rough, there's no way you can get on there and build a construction site, make a construction site out of it. So there used to be a lot of pre-design. They used to design it in small segments and then take the small segments over and drop them in. And that's the kind of analogy we're thinking of, that that you need to architect your change in a very different way, architect it in small bits that fit together later, rather than a big bit that you'll never build. The way you do that, though, it gives you new insights. If you're doing it in the transformation sprint method, it gives you new insights into how to resolve dysfunctionality in your organization. For sure, your transformation design will not include that, but that's what will drag you down. It's what drags transformations down. So we also think of it as creating transparency around operating model problems. Companies haven't had the opportunity to design their operating model. So now you can surface that, you can show them, you can start to show them the dysfunction in there, and actually create a roadmap for doing that change, for redesigning your operating model, developing operating model design skills, which a lot of companies don't actually have. Do you want to talk a bit more about the flipping the big transformation thing?
Well, I think that's the thing, is that we become very much as really connected to, you know, a transformation has to be big, and we just don't think that's actually true. And we actually think that there is a better way of doing this. And in fact, once we bring leaders into the transformation in more detail, rather than reviewing the RAG stages, you know, the actual progress of a program, being involved in the prioritization and some of the work itself, they are then also learning from, you know, using these new ways to work and being much more involved in the outcomes, which is like for us is like what you really want to see. And which will take some questions in a second. Now, just this is our last slide, which is really, we just think that businesses need to transform now more than ever particularly because of COVID. And talking to just the last couple of days, we were talking to companies that are gearing up to start their transformation. So we actually think the Agile approach is the answer. It's, for us, traditional transformation is pretty high risk, prone to failure. And if we think this is a much low risk way of working, the biggest critics we get are consultants, because what they find is that traditional methods actually are success factors for themselves, where they can get a lot of people into a transformation, maybe 5, 10, 50, 100 people. We don't think that's the right approach. And in fact, what we've tried to do in our book is to make it a little bit DIY, you know, for people. And using this 4-week time-boxed approach, we think is the right way forward. And you know, we're happy to now take some questions. I see there are some in the chat, so feel free.
So one question, is the flow model a more detailed version of the Toyota improvement kata?
How long have we got to answer these questions? That's a big one. What we find with flow, as it has become a little bit disjointed, and certain individuals and certain organizations are trying to carve pieces out and say, this is what it's like. You know, I've certainly used improvement katas before, and I've seen some of the stuff that Toyota have been producing. I mean, you know, if you think about some of the massive recalls of their cars and the problems they had in the production line in the US the last few years, I mean, I'm not saying that their way of working is incorrect, but I think that people are latching on to parts of it and trying to say it's a panacea for everything. And I'm not sure that's the case.
There's another question here, which is, sounds like the transformation sprint is a take on design sprints. Absolutely. Inspired by design sprint. Yeah, inspired by that idea that you should be able to learn this thing. I think one of the interesting things about the design sprint is, if you're going to do design sprints properly, you have to become a learner again. And very often, I mean, let's face it, design sprints are a 5-day learning exercise. You can be a scrum master or an agile coach in 2 days. So 5 days is better than 2 in my view.
Yeah, I was going to say the design sprint. I was on one in a previous job, and as the CTO, and I found it fascinating that it's the first time I went out and spoke to customers out in the street. So I actually found design thinking great, and it has inspired some of the stuff that we do. And in the book, we actually give some kudos to the people that came up with it.
Any other questions?
What are all the things in the chat then? Everyone's...
There's one more from Gary.
Yeah, if you were describing why this is different to approaching things in the traditional agile way, which you described earlier as being too IT centric.
Yeah, Well, I could start. You can follow in on that if you like. I think the thing is that, how many CEOs go to your stand-ups? How many senior leaders are involved in what you're delivering? And we find that, in fact, a lot of senior leadership teams in the business, they really fear the words Scrum and safe and scaled agile, and it puts them off. What you're asking them to do is to be themselves nimble. You want them to prioritize, you want them to make decisions, you want them to be involved in the outcomes. These are all the things that you say in Agile, but it tends to be only coming from the IT side of the house. So we try to get some of these concepts, some of this way of working into the business side, more upstream. And the more you can determine that something's going to be successful and valuable upstream, before it gets to people building it, the more likely it is going to be successful. So it's kind of a win-win, that situation. Any more questions?
Maybe I have a question then, Finn.
Yeah.
A lot of organizations, we say we want them to go agile. We want basically the IT departments to go agile, but yet we want leadership to be involved and take leadership and ownership of that. How do we manage it in organizations where leadership still make demands on the IT function, but yet are not in a leadership position and actually taking responsibility for those things? It's pushed to the organizational level to be dealt with.
Yeah. I mean, maybe Hayden's got a take on this, but I find that they tend to be proxies for the business, and sometimes they themselves are making decisions that the senior leaders are not even aware of. So all we need to do in an organization is do one visualization of the portfolio, get it on the wall, whether it be a virtual wall or whether a physical wall. So in one company, we had 320 projects on the wall, and then we said to the executives, we just need 20 minutes of your time to take a look at this. And they had a look at it and they couldn't believe what they saw. In fact, the CEO started taking things off the wall. We had to put some things back because they were for audit, but that's besides the point. But they didn't understand that this was being delivered by their teams, and their proxies were the people that were cultivating all that work. And so it's uncomfortable. It's partly, as Hayden says, a bit of dysfunctionality. And maybe it's not deliberate, but I find that people that run large programs sometimes run them so it gives them a job for 2 or 3 years, rather than what's the real value of what we're trying to do. So it's really about showing this in a lot more detail to people that are at the senior end, and they have to get their hands dirty. I was saying to a journalist this morning, that the key here is that it's no longer someone can be strategic and someone can be detailed, but you need to have both of those things now in leadership. You need to be able to make strategic decisions, but you also need to be in the detail. And they're the strongest leaders. And in fact, they're the people you should seek out to work for.
I think just approaching that problem in a slightly different way, what would be an empowering alternative? So we interviewed some folks at Amazon in the last few weeks for a project we're doing, and there the project itself is not owned by senior leadership; it's owned by the team doing it. So if you're the team leader, you've sold that project into the organization, and you've documented it. You've done your PR press release, you've done your FAQ, you've convinced people this is a good project. A leader above you has no right at that point to cancel it. You, on the other hand, have responsibility, and you've got the obligation either to make it work or find the point where you can acknowledge that it's not going to work. But as a leader, your job is to say, does it still fit the objectives of the organization? And is it being executed in line with the company's management tenets? So yes, on the one hand, we have organizations which constantly repress innovation because of leadership behavior, but there is an alternative, which is responsibility and the obligations that go with responsibility for people that have good ideas.
It's fascinating because they do a lot of Lighthouse projects at Amazon. One you may be seeing at the minute, you may be receiving packages that have no boxes. that they're actually the goods themselves. So they're testing to see whether A, the goods can be delivered without damage, and B, how much money they're going to save by not putting them into bigger boxes. And that came from a guy in Ireland who came up with that idea. He wrote the press release, he did the FAQ, and the leadership said, go forward. And that's how they do it. That's their Lighthouse Project. So that's going to be an operating model change for them, and not necessarily moving into a new business area. But I just find it fascinating, to be honest with you.
A couple of questions have come in before we finish, Mick. How do you manage the change, especially the mourning stroke grief? I think when you give people the opportunity to go into work and create value, rather than follow rules, or rather than be in meetings all day long to be aligned to somebody else's viewpoint, you've got happier people rather than grieving people. I think it's really critically important that we start designing work around regular delivery of value, because that's just a much better reason to get up for work in the morning.
Yeah, we're seeing, unfortunately, some bad behavior around leaders expecting people to be in 11 or 12 Zoom or Microsoft Team meetings every day. And that's seen as, that they're working hard. In fact, it's not effective at all. And we're doing some research where we're trying to see whether organizations could scale back and work 4 days a week. Some companies do have no Zoom meetings in the mornings whatsoever. They allow individuals to speak with each other. In fact, some companies are saying, call me on the phone, that thing that we used to use, rather than having Zoom meetings all the time. So we think this kind of hybrid work environment where people are at home and trying to deliver at the same time needs some work around what the leaders' kind of role will be in this moving forward, and what's the most effective way of people being productive. And it's not an easy one, to be honest with you.
Another question, have you made use of Wardley maps for understanding business or operating models? I have to tell you, we don't understand Wardley maps.
That's being a little bit unfair, but we have we've been involved. We've got a colleague of ours in Germany who's actually developing the training for Wardley maps, and he explained it to me, and I could understand it, but it is complex. And I think the Wardley mapping is good for people that are in that sort of architecture space, shall we say, and trying to decompose something that's complex. But no, we haven't really incorporated any of those ideas yet.
In the company I work for, the transformation has been informed to everyone with very little detail, just showing the big picture sometimes, but not the path or the steps leadership is taking. How important do you think it is that everyone is involved and know more about what is happening? A quick answer to that is that we think it's really important that they're involved in designing it. Yeah.
And I think that's a traditional approach, isn't it? You're like, here's the big transformation. We're going to do, it's going to be curing world hunger by next year. And we're not really going to tell you how we get there. And it's just, that tends to be an approach. I can see Mick getting ready for it to wrap us up, because we're going on. I just wanted to say that if people want to contact us, you can find us on LinkedIn and Twitter. We're happy to answer questions, and we enjoy actually interacting with the community. And thanks for the opportunity, guys.
So I'll say thank you, Finn and Hayden, for joining us today. Thank you, Biaz, for managing all of the Zoom stuff here. Thanks to our audience for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next learning series and eventually the conference. If anyone wants to save the chat, they can do so in the little file menu down the bottom, and they'll have the Business Agility Conference there as well, the address to it. Thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
All right, thank you.